Before we start, we will have Spanish interpreters here today. So I want to provide some instructions for turning on simultaneous interpretation for all attendees. To turn on simultaneous interpretation, find the globe icon at the bottom of the Zoom screen and select your preferred language as shown in the yellow arrow. The mute original audio option will turn off the overlay of voices for a clearer sound as shown by the red arrow. This applies to those listening in English as well. So if you hear more than one voice, please click the globe icon and then click English and then mute the original audio. Please note, if you don't see the globe icon on the bottom, your Zoom software may need updating in order to take advantage of the interpretation functions. Now I will give the instructions in Spanish. Bienvenidos, buenas tardes. Gracias por acompañarnos a la reunión de hoy del Grupo de Trabajo de Salud Pública de Acción Climática de California. Mi nombre es Abigail Ramírez y trabajo en la sección de Equidad en Salud y Cambio Climático del Departamento de Salud Pública de California. Antes de comenzar, el día de hoy tendremos presentadores que estarán hablando en inglés y español. Por lo tanto, quiero compartir instrucciones para activar la interpretación simultánea para todos los asistentes. Para activar la interpretación simultánea, busque el símbolo de globo o el mundo en la parte de abajo de la pantalla Zoom y seleccione su idioma preferido, como está mostrado por la flecha amarilla. La opción silenciar audio original desactivará la superposición de voces. Si escucha más de una voz, seleccione el símbolo de globo, luego haga clic en inglés y luego silenciar el audio original. Tenga en cuenta, si no ve el símbolo de globo en la parte de abajo, es posible que su sistema de Zoom necesite ser actualizado para así poder aprovechar las funciones de interpretación. Ahora le paso la palabra a mi colega Trinity Smith. Siguiente pantalla, por favor. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Abby, for those instructions, and welcome again, everyone. My name is Trinity Smith. I use she, her pronouns, and I am speaking to you from the traditional land of the Nisenan and Miwok peoples. I serve as a health program and policy specialist for the California Department of Public Health, Climate Change and Health Equity branch. I'm joined today by my colleagues Dan Wu, who's the team lead, and Linda Helland, the manager of the Climate Change and Health Equity branch. We're also joined by several other members of the Climate Change and Health Equity branch who will be helping us throughout today's session. This meeting is being facilitated by our team at the California Department of Public Health, or CDPH. The Climate Action Team Public Health Work Group is usually co-led by CDPH and the California Air Resources Board. Our work group meetings are designed to provide a forum for public health and other partners to learn about, discuss timely issues at the intersection of climate change and health equity. Today's presentations and discussions will focus on the intersection between actions to advance health equity for members of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and other gender identities and sexual orientation communities, or LGBTQ+ communities, as well as efforts to implement climate action and increase resilience in communities that are inequitably impacted by climate change related events. We'll also hear what state and local government can do to collaborate or support these community-led initiatives. Before getting started, we do have a few more housekeeping items. First, I will note that we welcome all to this learning space and encourage you to be brave and open to learning and unlearning with us today. However, we will be monitoring the chat and will not tolerate hateful, threatening speech of any kind, and will remove anyone from the meeting who perpetuates hate speech rooted in heteronormativity, homophobia, transphobia, racism, or white supremacy. We encourage everyone to continue their learning and unlearning journey beyond this meeting. And of course, during the meeting, do welcome thoughtful questions and engagement throughout. And so on that topic, for this meeting, we have muted all attendees, but encourage you to submit any questions you might have through the chat feature, which you can find on the bottom of your Zoom controls bar as shown on the screen here. We do ask that you turn off your video if you're not presenting, and recommend for optimum viewing that you go to the view icon, should be in the upper right corner of your Zoom window, and select side-by-side speaker or side-by-side gallery view. And if you have any concerns or technical difficulties throughout the meeting, you can send a private chat to our colleagues Will Jardell, Dian Wu, or Renee Zapata. And in addition to Spanish interpretation, we have real-time captions being provided today by eCaptions. You can find the closed caption feature along your Zoom controls bar at the bottom of your screen as well, shown here on the screen again. And for this reason, we'd like to remind presenters to speak clearly and at a measured pace. And this meeting is being recorded and should be posted online about a week from today at the California Climate Action Team Public Health Work Group webpage, as shown here on the screen. And I will be putting this link in the chat as well, but would first like to welcome my colleague Osamu Kumasaka to share a land acknowledgement for today's meeting. So Osamu, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Osamu Kumasaka, and the pronouns I use are he, him. I am not Native American, but I serve as the tribal climate specialist for our branch, the Climate Change and Health Equity branch. And I'm joining today from the East Bay, from the traditional territory of Huichin, the ancestral land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people. The conditions that exist today are not what tribal members and descendants of Native Americans would have made them. During hundreds of years of inequitable treatment, including land theft and genocide perpetrated by settlers, Native Americans have also been subject to heteronormativity, homophobia, and transphobia, concepts brought by Western colonizers. European taboos around sex, gender, and sexuality negatively impact queer, transgender, and gender nonconforming and two-spirit indigenous people to this day. Today, we acknowledge that the state of California exists on the occupied territories of 109 federally recognized tribes, 62 non-federally recognized tribes recorded by the Native American Heritage Commission, more tribes that are considering and awaiting recognition, and their descendants. Many of these tribes are dedicated to reclaiming ancestral lands, protecting precious lifeways, and resisting the onslaughts of global climate change. Tribal members and their descendants work together, heal together, and call for accountability from our state. Our team is committed to working alongside Indigenous peoples and following their lead as they work to uphold their sovereignty and dignity. We seek to build authentic, mutual, and lasting relationships with tribes and Indigenous communities. I'd like to say that land acknowledgement is only one small part of supporting Indigenous communities. I hope our land acknowledgement statement will inspire others to stand with us in solidarity with Native nations. Solidarity can look like donating your time and money to tribes and Indigenous-led organizations, amplifying the voices of Indigenous people, leading grassroots movements for justice and healing, and returning land to tribes. And with that, I will turn things back over to you, Trinity.
Thank you so much, Osamu, for that land acknowledgement and call to action for all of us. I'd now like to welcome Dr. Rohan Radhakrishna to provide some opening comments for today's meeting. Dr. Rohan Radhakrishna was appointed by Governor Newsom in early 2021 to lead the California Department of Public Health's Office of Health Equity, which includes the Climate Change and Health Equity branch. He also serves as the department's tribal liaison. He brings 20 years of experience working with impacted communities and previously served as co-chair of the statewide Health Equity Committee for the California Conference of Local Health Officers. Rohan spent 10 years at a local health department, most recently as Deputy Health Officer in Contra Costa County. His local experience responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, power shutoffs, wildfire smoke, and heat emergencies has solidified his commitment to addressing the overlapping public health crises of climate change and structural racism. Take it away, Rohan.
Thank you so much, Trinity, Osamu, all of our staff and participants. It's my honor and privilege to be with you all today. My name is Rohan. I use he, him pronouns, and I stand for love, dignity, and transformation. Like Osamu, today I am coming to you from Huichen, the land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people, and I also bring regards from our agency's equity officer, Dan Torres from the California Health and Human Services Agency. He was unable to join us, but wants to share his support for this work as he, in his new position, the first ever equity officer for our entire agency, was on the ground earlier this year with the floods in the Pajaro area. That really brings to light the interface and impact of the climate crisis on marginalized communities. In this case, his support for rural, LGBTQ, and non-English speaking communities. I'm going to take about 15 minutes to provide some opening comments, and I'm first going to talk about the intersection of the climate crisis and the LGBTQ plus community. I'm going to talk a little bit about the notion of climate resilience and justice, important to talk about the terms and the frames and the narrative that we bring to this aspirational work. I'll briefly describe the tremendous portfolio within our office, in particular, the gender health equity section and the climate change and health equity branch, and some opportunities for collaboration between those two teams. And then end by talking about opportunities for moving forward, where I'll name two guiding questions that I would like all of the participants to think about as you hear from our great panelists and speakers today. So to start, we know that while the LGBTQ plus community has seen some advancements in legal rights and services within the past decade, significant threats and barriers remain, such as access and affordability of gender and or sexually affirming healthcare, housing, and other life-saving services. Research has shown that LGBTQ plus populations are often inequitably impacted by natural disasters and climate-related events, such as flooding, extreme heat, or wildfire events. Thus, it's important to identify actions and form partnerships between government agencies, community-based organizations, LGBTQ plus community members, and others to advance solutions that concurrently alleviate inequities experienced by the LGBTQ plus community, reduce carbon emissions, and strengthen community resiliency, all in a way that's inclusive of LGBTQ plus populations, perspectives, and voices. I therefore want to start by sharing about the intersection of these two topics and how our state is positioned with our teams and our staff to support all of your ideas as we embrace this conversation and specific topic of the Climate Action Team Public Health Work Group today. So speaking on the intersection, we know that people who are most impacted by hazards and climate-related events are the same people who experience health inequities due to systemic oppression, marginalization, and exclusion that limits access to cash, to capital, and to decision-making power, what equity is truly about. Climate change affects all humans and Californians, but some communities and individuals experience worse health impacts from the climate crisis. People with existing health conditions, those inadequately housed, outdoor workers, certain communities of color, immigrants, the very young and older adults, pregnant people, people with disabilities, those with low income, and those socially isolated face a disproportionate risk of harm from climate impacts. This has been seen from a variety of conditions, including a study on the most recent drought in California that found that low-income households, people of color, and communities already burdened by environmental pollution suffered the most severe impacts caused by water supply shortages and the rising cost of water. Now, this also includes people who identify as queer, transgender, and gender nonconforming. And we'll hear more directly from some of our speakers and panelists, in particular, Leo Goldsmith, a doctoral student who's been studying the health impacts of climate change on Two-Spirit and LGBTQ+ communities. They are also a technical contributor to the sexual and gender minority section in the 5th National Climate Assessment, and we're excited to have Leo with us today. A few more data points from the literature around this intersection to factor in is data from the age population of 18 to 25. We know there's a big focus on transitional age youth, and in particular housing, as well as the behavioral health needs of that population. But we know that in the 18 to 25-year-old population, LGBTQ+ people have more than a double greater risk of experiencing homelessness. This is one example, and I'll be happy to put some links in the chat when I conclude my remarks. Also, transgender individuals experience homelessness are more likely to be unsheltered due to discrimination in shelter spaces. Our agency is a co-lead on the California Interagency Council on Homelessness, and therefore it's important to look at housing as health, housing as climate resiliency, and acknowledge the disproportionality of this life-saving shelter as adaptive capacity for the climate crisis. Additionally, due to discriminatory housing policies and intentional exclusion of LGBTQ+ people in certain communities and spaces, they have been subject to higher poverty rates and disproportionate burden of pollution compared with cisgender heterosexual counterparts. Studies have found that areas with higher proportions of same-sex couples have seen an increased amount of hazardous air pollutants compared with areas with lower proportion of same-sex couples, as one example. This has resulted in LGBTQ+ folks experiencing higher rates of chronic disease associated with environmental exposure, such as respiratory diseases, cardiovascular diseases, and cancer. Additionally, LGBTQ, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color can experience compounding marginalization, exclusion, and oppression due to the intersectionality of patriarchy, homophobia, and systemic racism. Climate change on top of all of this is therefore a threat multiplier that can deepen existing inequities. Now, I want to talk briefly about the terms and the notion of climate resilience and justice, something that our speakers will bring up as well. One definition of climate resilience, which is used in the Governor's Office of Planning and Research guidebook on planning and investing for Resilience California, comes from Judith Rodin and says, quote, "The capacity of any entity, an individual, a community, an organization, or a natural system to prepare for disruptions, to recover from shocks and stresses, and to adapt and grow from a disruptive experience." That is a definition of climate resilience that we can hold with us for our conversation today. In our work, we see climate resilience as not simply people bouncing back after disaster and disaster, but it's more focused on what the Movement Strategy Center notes as bouncing forwards, where a just society in a renewable, sustainable economy marked by inclusive participation is involved in the policy decisions that affect their daily lives before, during, and despite climate-related events, which we know will increase in frequency and intensity. We'll hear a recorded presentation today from Vanessa Raditz that will talk about how LGBTQ+ populations and communities embody resistance and resilience and have existing strengths and efforts underway that work within the intersection of climate, health, and equity that we can learn from. We'll hear more about some films from Vanessa. And I also wanted to share another concept around climate justice that comes from our neighbors up north in Washington State's Department of Health, where they define climate justice as both process as well as goal. Climate justice is focused on addressing the unequal impacts of climate change by prioritizing the health and safety of those who face the greatest risk as we prepare for and recover from climate events. The goals of climate justice are to make sure no one is left behind in the climate crisis and to transition to a healthier and more fair future for all living beings. This also means that we move away from fossil fuels and move towards a just transition that promotes sustainable and stable economy, advances jobs and health equity, and is rooted in a thriving and healthy environment. So that's a little bit about our intersection and some of these terms. I'll end by sharing a few minutes about our existing work. We are thrilled to have the Gender Health Equity section within the Office of Health Equity, largely thanks to many stakeholder initiatives. And we'll put the link in the chat so you can learn more about that team that plays a leadership role in developing programs and policies intended to eliminate gender-based health disparities. Some of the accomplishments include the TGI unit, the Transgender, Gender Diverse and Intersex Wellness and Health Equity unit, which is a first in the nation unit at a state level health department, created solely to elevate health equity issues experienced by TGI people caused by systemic discrimination, including in healthcare settings, housing, employment, and public accommodations. They also lead the Transgender, Gender, and Non-Conforming Intersex Wellness and Equity Fund. We also have an LGBTQ Health Equity Initiative that aims to fund and address gaps in knowledge and research and increase access to culturally appropriate and affirming health services. And an additional unit called the Reproductive Justice and Abortion Access Unit that leads the implementation of the California Reproductive Justice and Freedom Fund. We also are engaged in a SOGI, Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Work Group on data collection recommendations, and we'll be sharing more guidance documents on questions, wording, visualization in the new year. Our climate change and health equity branch is growing and is now 17 team members strong and has a tremendous amount of work that you've heard about in our pre-existing work group. So I'll skip over that for today and end by talking about our opportunities moving forward. So we know that climate change is a threat multiplier, deepening existing inequities. Yet addressing climate change is a huge opportunity to improve health because many of the actions we take to address climate change can also improve health and equity in terms of the outcomes. Until recently, there's been a gap in our understanding of how environmental and climate injustice specifically impact LGBTQ+ people. Adding that lens to our environmental and climate justice work will ensure that we are advocating for a livable climate for every community. And it's vital that we continue to listen to the stories of communities that experience multiple systems of oppression to truly deliver on climate justice. So we want to pose two questions for you all to keep in mind for our session today. The first is, what are examples of climate resilience and climate action that are being led and implemented by LGBTQ+ communities, including LGBTQ+ BIPOC communities? Successes, strengths, challenges, and barriers that they've encountered. We want to hear about it. Second, what are supportive or collaborative roles that local health departments or state agencies, whether in health or the environment, could play within queer, transgender, and gender nonconforming, Black, Indigenous, and people of color led efforts to do climate and health equity related research, planning, and action? So I'd ask you to keep those two questions in mind as we move towards our panelists and engage in discussion. And thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you so much, Rohan, for providing that statewide context and framing for today's discussion. Always appreciate your perspective and hearing you speak on so many intersecting topics. Now we will welcome our first presenter, Leo Goldsmith. As Rohan mentioned, Leo is a doctoral student at the Yale School of the Environment, studying the health impacts of climate change on two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, asexual, plus communities. They are also a technical contributor on sexual and gender minorities in the 5th National Climate Assessment and a board member of Out for Sustainability. Leo, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak for today, and thank you so much for that really great introduction. Hello, everyone. I'm super excited that this meeting is happening, especially given that the 5th National Climate Assessment Human Health Chapter recently came out and stated that sexual and gender minorities are a population that is at risk for climate-related impacts. So that's what I'm going to focus on today for my presentation, just kind of the disproportionate impacts on the 2S LGBTQI plus communities due to climate change. And then afterwards, a very good colleague of mine, Vanessa Raditz, will be kind of focusing more on the climate resilience through a pre-recorded presentation that they've done. Next slide, please. Before I get into some of the impacts, I first just want to provide a definition for gender identity, sexual orientation, gender expression, and sex characteristics. So everybody, well, first I'll say that this is called the genderbread person. And basically what this depicts is that everybody has a gender identity or a gender that they identify with. And some people have no gender, which is called agender. Everyone has a sexual attraction or no attraction to gender or genders. Also, everyone has an assigned sex at birth. So this would be something that your doctor put onto your birth certificate when you were born. And then everyone also has a gender expression or ways that you express your gender. So this could be through clothing, through hair, the way you talk, and more. Next slide. Within the 2S LGBTQI plus community, sexual orientation identities can include lesbian or gay, bisexual, queer, and more. And so what you see here is a very small subset of ways that people can identify. And then on the other side, gender identities can include binary genders, so man or woman. And within that, there are people who identify as cisgender or those who identify as their assigned sex at birth. And then transgender or people who do not identify as their assigned sex at birth. There's also non-binary genders. And so what this can mean for some people is that they identify their gender along a continuum between man and woman. And other folks may identify their gender as being completely outside of that spectrum. And so some non-binary individuals identify as transgender, and other non-binary individuals may not identify as transgender. There's also two-spirit, which is what the 2S at the beginning of the acronym stands for. And so this is a identity that's primarily used within North American Indigenous populations and can refer to sexual orientation or gender identity. Next slide. And so I really want to emphasize that 2S LGBTQI plus communities are highly diverse, not only along sexual orientation and gender identity, but also race, ethnicity, age, class, abilities, and more. And so no matter what community that you're working with, there are going to be individuals who identify as 2S LGBTQI plus. Next slide. So next, I'm just going to go over briefly some of the climate and health impacts on these communities. So starting off, before disasters, 2S LGBTQI plus communities have higher rates of cardiovascular disease, respiratory illnesses such as asthma and COPD, HIV/AIDS, and also mental illnesses such as anxiety, depression, PTSD, and more. And so all of these different health outcomes can be worsened by climate-related disasters such as extreme heat, wildfires, and hurricanes or extreme precipitation events, and also extreme pollen events as well. And so not only are 2S LGBTQI plus communities not having their physical and mental health needs before disasters, but also during and after disasters. And this is primarily, as you'll kind of see throughout this presentation, largely due to being underrepresented, invisible, and also discriminated against. Next slide. So before, during, and after disasters, 2S LGBTQI plus individuals have difficulty accessing medications. So this is especially true for transgender individuals and those with HIV/AIDS. And so, for example, for trans folks, hormone replacement therapy is extremely important for some transgender individuals in terms of their mental health and also their physical health. And similar for those who have HIV/AIDS, they may not have, there's actually been research that has shown that at least during wildfires, that the access to antiretroviral therapy tends to go down during disasters. Next slide. There's also discrimination and bias in services and resource distribution before, during, and after disasters. Family structures such as chosen family, which is just defined as a group of individuals that you're not biologically related to, but that serves as that like very important social support network, are not acknowledged within disaster and emergency management policies or guidelines. So this can lead to those relationships not being recognized and can lead to folks being separated, which can impact mental health and resiliency during disasters. Also, items necessary for 2S LGBTQI plus communities, such as items used by transgender individuals, such as binders, or items for drag artists, such as wigs and clothing, are not included in insurance coverage as it's not deemed a necessity. So this can really impact the mental and physical health of transgender individuals, and also the economic security of drag artists. Also, because of the anti-LGBTQI plus policies that have been proliferating across the US, as of now, there's been, well, since the beginning of 2023, there's been over 500 bills that have been introduced. And so there's also been an uptick of hate crimes towards 2S LGBTQI plus communities, such as destruction of community spaces. And so this picture on the left actually depicts the Gainesville Pride Center in Florida that was vandalized during Hurricane Ian. Next slide. Here are just like a few examples of the ways that this can kind of play out for 2S LGBTQI plus communities during disasters. So during Hurricane Harvey, these communities experienced blame from religious communities, discrimination in temporary emergency shelters, especially transgender individuals, and denied access to disaster relief services. During the 2021 Portland heat wave, due to disproportionate homelessness in the communities, as well as fear of discrimination of overnight shelters and over policing, 2S LGBTQI plus communities were at a higher risk for impacts due to like extreme heat illness and mortality. In the Northern California wildfires during 2021 and 2022, it was found that individuals with HIV/AIDS found that their access to healthcare, their mental and physical health, their social and economic well-being, and also nutrition and exercise were all impacted during these events. Next slide. And so I want to leave off with just providing a few recommendations. So there's a need for systematic and consistent collection that is voluntary and anonymous of environmental and climate related sexual orientation and gender identity data. there is very, very few data sets, and actually only one that exists out there through the Household Pulse Survey through the Census Bureau. They have natural disaster data that collects this, but it's extremely important for this data to exist for further research to understand what it is that is impacting the community and what can be done to remedy that. There also needs to be better consistent collection of sexual orientation and gender identity data related to health as well. Next slide. There should be co-creation of climate and health equity policies and activities alongside 2S LGBTQI plus communities to ensure that those programs and policies are actually benefiting the community and not accidentally being harmful. Next slide. And then there also should be leveraging existing 2S LGBTQI plus climate resilience that's already occurring to not reinvent the wheel, and also provide support and resources for what's already happening. And also to leverage the individuals within your agency who may have knowledge and know what barriers are in place for 2S LGBTQI plus communities in this field as well. And so lastly, I just want to mention that if you're interested in learning more about these types of topics, there will be a webinar next Tuesday, December 13th at 11 a.m. Pacific time, focusing on disaster displacement in LGBT individuals. So the Household Pulse survey data that I mentioned before, there was a group of researchers, me, Dr. Michael Mendez, and also Jessica Geiger from Claremont Graduate University, who did a data analysis and looked at the data that compares LGBT individuals to non-LGBT individuals. And so I'll put the policy brief that recently came out into the chat, as well as the registration link. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation, Leo, and for sharing that additional opportunity to learn more. We are now going to take a short 5-minute break. So we will plan to resume at 10:47. So feel free to step away, take a bio break, get some water. And again, see you back here at 10:47. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. We will move into the second half of our meeting now. And so our next presenter, Vanessa Raditz, unfortunately is feeling unwell this morning and is not able to join us. However, they did, out of the kindness of their own heart, record their presentation. So we will be showing that now. But first I will introduce Vanessa. Vanessa is the project director of the Q Ready initiative with Out for Sustainability. They are filmmaker of the films Fire and Flood and Can't Stop Change, and are currently studying their master's in geography and doctorate in educational theory and practice at the University of Georgia. And give us one moment to transition to the recording of their presentation.
Good morning. My name is Vanessa Raditz, and I am the Q Ready project director for Out for Sustainability. I'm sorry that I cannot be there simultaneous with you all right now, but I am grateful to still have a little bit of time to share with you what we are doing with the Q Ready program with Out for Sustainability to develop resilience preparedness by and for LGBTQ+ communities. So Q Ready is responding to two big problems. As you've just heard a bit about from Leo, the first is the heightened vulnerability of queer and trans communities to climate disasters. And this doesn't come from something innate to our gender and sexualities, but rather comes from the interlocking social, economic, and political systems that marginalize our communities, such that multiply marginalized communities have compounded intersectional impacts. We are also addressing the invisibility of this vulnerability. So the lack of representation of LGBTQ+ communities in disaster preparedness and climate justice makes it such that the vulnerability of our communities is really unthinkable, to the point that it's hard for organizations and disaster preparedness professionals like yourselves to take our considerations, to take our communities into consideration and develop plans for our safety. And so Q Ready envisions both a set of multi-scale programs for LGBTQ centers, disaster professionals, educators, and community organizers, but then also a set of tools and partnerships that meet the needs of multiply marginalized communities who are on the front lines of climate injustice by creating these kinds of collaborations that can honor their leadership and lift up their work as we pursue that first set of materials and trainings. So I'm going to start by sharing a little bit more about vulnerability, a little bit more about invisibility, and then I want to share with you some of what we have learned along the way from working with frontline communities about the challenges of talking about resilience, and what we have learned through those processes of trying to reclaim it with frontline communities for whom the word resilience has been used against them. So to start, you can read much more about this. Leo and I co-published an article with Dr. Michael Mendez called Queer and Present Danger, Understanding the Disparate Impacts of Disasters on LGBTQ+ communities. And part of what we write about in here is that understanding the vulnerabilities to our community requires also understanding some of the fundamental systems and belief systems that have led to the marginalization of queer and trans communities to get today, particularly the theological origins in Christianity that have said that queer and trans people are crimes against nature. And this is particularly important because these kinds of arguments resurface during times of disaster, particularly as disasters are called God's retribution for the sins of queer and trans people. So this can create conditions whereby there's a heightened level of violence facing our communities, and also places that are safe spots for others, such as faith-based organizations, may compound violence rather than relieving violence in those moments. But it's not just these things that are unique to queer and trans people. Vulnerability, as we contextualize it in this article, has a lot to do with the social, economic, and political systems, such that LGBTQ plus people today are more likely to be marginalized in other ways, such as being impoverished, homeless, diagnosed with a mental illness, diagnosed with a chronic illness, unable to access healthcare, and incarcerated. And so a key take-home point that I hope you will all bring back to your spaces is that if you are already working on frontline vulnerabilities to climate change, then there are queer and trans people within each of those groups already known to be vulnerable during moments of disaster. And so it's not about bringing a whole separate community necessarily into your analysis, but to understand that there are unique intersecting needs of the queer and trans people within, for instance, the homeless or houseless community. Let's also talk about invisibility, because it's so hard to bring up conversations about those kinds of contextual vulnerabilities in our communities because of the preponderance of these kinds of representations. So as part of building a civil rights strategy for LGBTQ plus rights, there has been a choice among some in our movement to put forward representations that show assimilation into the nationalism and consumerism of American culture, including, like you can see here, BSVP, Stonewall Top Global Employer, right? And so these kinds of representations and the way they portray this idea of the myth of gay affluence, they can make it hard to imagine that our communities are more vulnerable during times of disasters. And also, when it comes to speaking with people in the climate justice movement, hard to understand how the vulnerabilities facing our communities are related to the other kinds of frontline vulnerabilities faced by Black and poor and other multiply marginalized communities who are at the leadership of climate justice movements, because of the way that our communities have been represented and the choices of some assimilationist and powerful groups within our communities. And so this creates issues, right? So as Kim Hall, a philosopher, has written, whether or not one survived Hurricane Katrina was not simply the result of living below or above sea level. It was also about being taken account into the city's planning for the future, being thought of as someone to consider in light of possible disasters. Right? Because it's not just these homonormative representations. Our communities are so much more diverse than that. And it's not just about vulnerability. Our communities are also at the leadership of climate justice movements and developing new strategies to create belonging in nature, whether that's the queer nature photo in the top right corner, or to support the immediate survival needs of multiple enlarged communities during disasters, such as in the top left corner, Stacy Milburn, may she rest in peace, who helped support disabled queer communities and other disabled communities during the fires and power shutoffs. And so it's important to remember that queer and trans communities are not just vulnerable victims during times of disaster, but that the histories of fighting for survival and recognition throughout LGBTQ plus movement history have created a set of tools for resistance and resilience during these moments of disaster. And so for instance, here is an example from Hurricane Harvey in Texas, where the Montrose Center raised and distributed millions of dollars to LGBTQ plus communities, including to the very frontline group, Latina de Trans en Tejas. And so this also brings up an important thing about resilience that I'm about to discuss in more depth, which is that in the words of Gorman Murray and colleagues, acknowledging the resilience of a community certainly does not mean a given social group or community should be left to its own devices in and through policy and planning. Capacity is inhibited by structural constraints and can be enabled and enhanced by the provision of resources by governments, authorities, and organizations. Basically, acknowledging resilience and partnering with communities and lifting up like an assets-based approach to partnership doesn't necessarily mean that the communities do not need your help, right? And particularly when it comes to things like lack of funding. And so, as I said, the second part of the Q Ready vision has really been about these kinds of partnerships and collaborations to try and uplift frontline leadership. And part of that, in terms of how we conceptualize resilience, started with the Fire and Flood film, which I've been working on over the past 7 years to document and tell the stories of queer and trans people in Northern California, starting with the Tubbs Fire in the fall of 2017, which was nearly simultaneous to Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. And so the film tells that simultaneous, like, woven story through the voices of indigenous communities, Two-Spirit communities here in California, and colonized people in Puerto Rico. The film not only highlights some of these frontline vulnerabilities, but also puts them in a narrative that connects with the climate justice movement's analysis of some of the roots of climate change, including colonization and the need for land back. And so this is a representational justice piece that attempts to make the needs of our communities during disasters more imaginable, but also to foster the kind of coalitions that can address the root causes of both the socio and ecological violences in this moment of accelerating climate change. Part of that over time as a piece of representational justice has meant really dedicating ourselves to the relationships with the communities in the film, including communities in Puerto Rico. So one way we've done that is by trying to support the professional development and create spaces for communities to speak about their own strategies. And so we sponsored a cohort of people from Puerto Rico to come to the Creating Change Conference, which is a national LGBTQ conference led by the LGBTQ plus task force. And during that day-long institute that we led on queer climate justice, folks from Puerto Rico shared with us some of the complexities of this idea of resilience. So I want to share a couple of those quotes now. As one person said, as a Black Puerto Rican, listening to the word resilience, it's a bit of an uncomfortable conversation to have. Black, queer, and living in the Caribbean, we're basically just left to fend for ourselves. And that's often put on our resiliency. Yes, we are here because our ancestors were resilient and we're continuing that. This doesn't mean that we don't need to be funded. Another person echoed this point. Right? Resilience, to me, the word is really romanticized, glorified. There's this phrase in Puerto Rico, Puerto Rico se levanta. That means that every time there's something bad that happens, we have to come together as a community. And this is only on us as a community because the government doesn't do anything. It's like, look how strong, they can throw anything at them and look at them go, making it through devastation and crisis after crisis and death and no support. The idea of reclaiming it, like other words are reclaimed, was interesting to me. And so continuing to delve into that idea of what would it mean to reclaim a word like this, another person shared that real resilience isn't just about letting the world crack you open and saying, I'm going to make it anyway. Resilience is about literally changing the rules. They say this is the way that you win, but what if we didn't play that game at all? What if we just played a different game? And so we've been thinking through this and contemplating what these frontline stories mean for the way that we talk about and conceptualize resilience. What is this different game? And what we've come up with so far is that when we talk about climate resilience, we're referring to collective action to respond to frontline needs before, during, and after socio-ecological crises, while addressing the root causes of social, political, and economic disparities in a way that is intersectional, just, decolonizing, and collectively designed. And so we have a couple key things that I want to share, and then I'm going to end this. But for folks such as you in the disaster professional community, public health community, I want to share that we currently have a inclusive and equitable emergency management for LGBTQIA communities guide up on Out for Sustainability's website, which Leo led the process of creating. And so this shares a number of best practices that come out of a series of workshops, webinars that Out for Sustainability led with FEMA Region 9. And so I highly recommend that you look to that and bring that back to your communities and your centers. We're also doing some work to advocate more funding mechanisms for distributing disaster planning and response funds to LGBTQ+ organizations in similar ways that this is done for faith-based organizations. And so similarly for LGBTQ organizations with physical spaces, these are things we envision doing in the future when we have more capacity, but I also highly invite you, if this fits within the work that your organization does, to consider moving in this direction. The same way that libraries and faith-based organizations have become key partners in disaster relief and response work. It is, I think, a really under-tapped opening to partner with LGBTQ centers to do some similar work that is tailored and specific to the needs of our communities. So that includes training for staff and community members, but also logistical and financial support to develop the kinds of infrastructure to provide mass care and emergency response, and also to create some, again, really the physical supports for sustainability and resilience, such as solar panels, which could enable the ability for community centers to support people with disabilities during these power shutoffs, for instance. That LGBTQ centers can be a partner in that. We're doing a lot of work to partner with educators, including the Fire and Flood film that I mentioned. And then finally, this kind of work to partner with and uplift individuals and community grassroots organizations, such as the fiscal sponsorship that we provide and small scale mutual aid grants. So again, I'm so sorry that I can't be there in person to answer questions, but I work very closely with Leo, and I'm sure that he'll be able to answer your questions well. And if you want to follow up, please, by all means, you can reach me at vanessa.raditz@outforS.org. Thank you so much for your time and for this invitation to speak with you all.
All right. Just want to again send huge gratitude, and maybe we can all send some healing thoughts and energy Vanessa's way. Really, really appreciate them sharing that recording of their presentation. We do have one final presentation.
Hi, everyone. It looks like we may have lost Trinity. So I'm going to hopefully be able to just continue where she left off, and we're going to introduce our next speaker. Give me 1 second as we. All right. So next, we wanted to welcome Kenna Lee. Kenna is the local health department climate specialist with our team at CDPH, and she's also the co-founder of the Sonoma County chapter of 350 org, the current co-chair of the Climate Action Committee of the City of Sebastopol, and is currently on a Johns Hopkins research team studying family planning and displaced populations. So take it away, Kenna. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much, Trinity and Dan. Hello, everyone. I use she, her pronouns, and I am speaking to you from Coast Miwok and Pomo traditional lands. I also want to acknowledge the privilege I benefit from as a cisgendered white woman with adequate financial resources. And I want to acknowledge the fact that marriage rights continue to be denied for many people in many places in many ways. Dan, are you going to start my slides? Thank you. As a long-term climate activist, I'm often invited to speak to youth climate groups, classrooms, and other gatherings of young people. I tailor these talks to the requests and to the audience, but I found over time that I invariably include at least some version of the history of same-sex marriage, as it's a story that I lived, which infuses my presentations with hope. And I don't think our young people can do without hope. It's just so scary for them right now. I have 3 of my own, and it's scary for all of us, but the young people are seeing such vast uncertainty in their futures. Next slide, please. Now, there are many more comprehensive histories of this particular civil rights struggle. I'm not pretending to cover this one exhaustively, but rather just to illustrate how change happens, as they say, slowly and then all at once. I'll be going a little more deeply and more personally into how this timeline felt to those of us writing it, which was more like a roller coaster than the neat lines you see here. So you can see the dark blue squares are setbacks, the green squares are progress, and that top line, that covers almost 30 years from 1972 to the year 2000. In the middle of that line in 1996, towards the end of that timeline, I just want to call out that President Bill Clinton signed the Defense of Marriage Act. He had been the first presidential candidate ever to say gay out loud in public, which was so exciting. But then he did sign the Defense of Marriage Act, denying federal recognition of gay marriage, even if it was becoming legal in states. You can move down to the second line. You see it's half and half blue, half green. And that's only 6 years. And then the third line, all green, leading up to radical change, only 5 years. Ending in the 2015 US Supreme Court decision, which struck down all bans on gay marriage. Next slide, please. So how did that timeline play out for real people living it? So this is a little bit of my personal marriage timeline. In 1993, I got engaged. We weighed back and forth. Did we want to go all the way to Hawaii to try to get a legal stamp of approval on our marriage? We decided instead to get married where it was accessible to friends and family, and had a large wedding in Tennessee on September 21st, 1996, which had no legal repercussions for us whatsoever. During our wedding, actually, Bill Clinton that's when he chose to sign the Defense of Marriage Act. Then in 1997, we moved to California and went from being harassed on a at least weekly basis to being not harassed at all, which was amazing. And then in 1999, we were able to register as domestic partners. Next slide, please. In February 2004, San Francisco started giving out marriage licenses, and we were not going to drive down to San Francisco to stand in line outdoors all day to get married in the rain with 2 kids, until our friend Tony called us and asked why we weren't in line. Tony's a Black man, and he reminded us that when he was born, it was illegal for him to marry a white woman. and said, this is the next step. Get in line. So we did. Then in August of that same year, our marriage was legally voided. In 2008, California started issuing marriage licenses. Again, that was too late for me. My marriage was on the rocks. That same year, Bill Clinton decided to robocall me to tell me to vote against Prop 8, which was the voters of California's opportunity to ban gay marriage, and they chose to do that. In 2009, I personally got a dissolution of domestic partnership, which is what you get if you don't qualify for a divorce. And in 2010, marriage became legal in California and stays legal through today. And then that last 2013, should say 2015 through today, I can get married anywhere in the United States. Next slide, please. So this slide, when you look at it, it looks like an inevitable arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice timeline. But when you're in it in 1986, it feels like nothing is happening except a plague. In 1990, you know with absolute certainty that your marriage will never be legally recognized in your lifetime. The people saying it's possible seem naive and blind to reality. Each of these setbacks after progress feels just like the spit feels running down your cheek. It feels like the fear of someone creeping up behind you. It feels like people hate you and like they always will. The timeline you can see in retrospect as it trends from setbacks to progress and leads to radical change doesn't feel in any way guaranteed. Next slide. But look at this map. This was simply unimaginable. You can look at this and only see how far we have to go, or like me, you can marvel that this map exists at all. It fills me with gratitude for all the people who believed and worked and continue to work. Next slide, please. When I look back at this timeline, it seems more clear that the bans and the setbacks were part of the forward progress. If they ban you, then they are acknowledging that you exist. And this is why I don't feel so hopeless about the rash of anti-trans legislation. They are codifying the fact that trans people are part of our society. It feels awful, but to me, it doesn't feel hopeless. In climate, we think about tipping points. A tipping point is a critical threshold that when crossed leads to large, accelerating, and often irreversible changes. We worry about tipping points ecologically, and we celebrate them politically, socially, and technologically. My point is you don't always see the socio-political tipping point coming, but for us, a really big one came. Next slide, please. And our community has even more positive contributions to offer the climate conversation. We have these resilience narratives. We are great at mutual aid. We do so much powerful advocacy for public health. And over again, we affirm that love is more powerful than fear in the long run. As Vanessa pointed out, our resilience narratives can be complex. However, these are essential themes that the climate crisis is bringing to more and more communities, themes that have elevated and sustained the LGBTQ+ community and that we can use to lead. Next slide, please. For me, the story of gay marriage in the US informs my climate work in a very simple way. It's a story in which the impossible becomes possible. Thank you for letting me share it.
All right. Thank you, Kenna, and thank you everyone for bearing with my loss of internet there for a moment. We now will be moving into our panel discussion. So I will pass it over to Linda Helland to lead that discussion.
Thank you, Trinity. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. It is a little quiet.
Okay, I will speak up.
Yeah, that's better.
Thank you. Okay, it is definitely a day of technical challenges, and I am on my phone, so I will not be on camera. I apologize for that. I'm Linda Helland. I use she and her pronouns. I manage the Climate Change and Health Equity branch. I want to give a very warm debt of gratitude to Leo, Vanessa, and Kenna for identifying the barriers and the challenges and the inequities facing LGBTQIA people, and also talking to us about their strengths and assets and hope Kenna, you make me think of the quote by Gandhi, who said that first they ignore you, then they ridicule you, then they fight you, and then you win. So I think we are in the fighting stage that is going to lead to victory. And that is leading to victory led by LGBTQIA people themselves. So to launch into the discussion, since we only have about 10 minutes, Leo and Kenna, I will ask you a few questions. I'm so sorry that we do not have Vanessa, and I hope that they feel better soon. So Leo, you told us that in your final kind of call to action that we can leverage resilience activities already occurring in the LGBTQIA+ community. Can you please give us a few examples of those actions that are already leading to climate resilience for LGBTQIA folks?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. I'll start off by saying, echoing Kenna and Vanessa, a lot of the resilience that's already occurring is happening within the communities itself. Unfortunately, local, state, and federal government often does not provide the resources and support needed for these communities. And so what we're seeing is a lot of LGBTQ+ community centers providing shelter, food, and other resources all across the US. So the Montrose Center in Houston was one that was mentioned that provided resources and support during Hurricane Harvey. Also, queer and trans organizations that are providing funding are, for example, the Estrella Foundation has a queer and climate justice fund that's providing funding to communities for resilience projects, as well as Out for Sustainability that is doing what's called fiscal sponsorships. So grassroots groups aren't able to actually apply for grant funding themselves, but the nonprofit can basically funnel that money to them. And so it's a lot of providing shelter, food, other necessities. And so ways that, for example, CDPH can help is kind of identifying what resources and funding exist and reaching out to us LGBTQI+ communities. I think a lot of, there's not really like targeted kind of guidance or resources towards those communities, and like knowing that that they can go to, for example, different agencies for assistance if it exists. I think also reaching out to those community centers, particularly in California, and kind of seeing what is already happening in the ground and asking what are some ways that you all can provide support and resources would be really helpful. And also just like incorporating LGBTQI+ to us LGBTQI+ language into your resources and guidance is something that would be really helpful as well, just to kind of name those communities so that they're seen within the work that you all do.
Thank you so much. Those are really specific and really helpful, and we will do that. You also talked about policies specifically. What are some ways that local health departments and state agencies and individuals can support policy passages that or adoption and implementation that can support LGBTQIA people in the face of climate change and to reduce the underlying inequities that underlie disproportionate vulnerability to harm from climate change?
That's a really great question. I would say that as specifically in policies regarding climate change and disasters, what isn't seen is like the explicit mention of SOGIASC or sexual orientation, gender identity, sex characteristics, and gender expression. So most often it's labeled just as sex. So that can be interpreted in many different ways. So being very explicit about those about SOGIASC is highly important. I think also like non-discrimination clauses is important, as well as ways for to us LGBTQI plus people to actually put in a grievance if discrimination does occur. I think also regarding policy, something I mentioned before as well, data collection and providing clear guidelines on how to collect that data is necessary. And yeah, I'll stop there. I don't want to take up too much time.
Those are excellent. Thank you so much, Leo. And Kenna, do you have thoughts on the policy arena as well, and what local health departments, state agencies, and individuals can do to set a more equitable policy agenda?
Well, I would really just underscore what Leo was saying about proactive inclusion. For instance, where I live, we have a physician activist group that does, or kind of larger healthcare activist group that does a lot of very proactive outreach to the LGBTQ plus community, and pulls them in when policy discussions are happening. So I think it's, to me, I see it so much in this positive frame of like, oh my gosh, I'm always surprised. I'm like, wow, this is happening. This is happening. People are reaching out. People are pulling our communities into these discussions. Our communities where I live have taken a lot of power over the years, starting building coalitions during the AIDS crisis. So I think that's what CDPH is doing with gender health equity and moving that forward in those conversations, and walking into rooms, making sure they're seated at the table for LGBT plus Q plus people in lots of different forums is just so helpful in continuing to build this movement and push for inclusion.
Thank you so much, Kenna. That's really helpful as well. Thank you for your depth of experience that you bring to this discussion. Now we want to hear, we just have a few minutes left. If there's any additional audience questions, please use the chat Q&A function. I see there we have one question. How can queer ecology or ecofeminism inform climate change and health equity programming? Leo and or Kenna.
Go ahead, Leo.
I was just going to say, sorry, I got distracted. Could you repeat that question real quick?
Yeah. How can queer ecology or ecofeminism inform climate change and health equity programming?
Yes, absolutely. So I think it's extremely critical to learn more about queer ecology and ecofeminism, particularly because it is super important in the ways that we conceptualize nature and climate change in a way that isn't kind of clouded by ideas of what's called heteronormativity, or basically looking through a lens of like cisgender heterosexual ideas, which tend to often be very binary. And so looking along lines of like, what does it mean to deconstruct the binary between nature and humans, and like how we relate to the earth, and the ways that like queer and trans knowledge can help inform solutions in the way that we view the work that we're doing. So this includes things like data and climate impacts, and who those, like how it's impacting certain populations and the solutions to those things. And so highly encourage, if you're not familiar with queer ecology, to look up the literature. There's definitely podcasts out there on that, as well as like webinars and things.
Yeah, and I think I would underline that and just add one more call out of the way that ecofeminism continues to question the historical legacy of patriarchy and the ways that that informs our social political systems and the ways in which those things are harmful. And so just continuing to go back and look at things with fresh eyes, with fresh framing, and from a kind of elemental place where we are in communication with nature, more one-to-one, gives us a way of looking at our built environment, both built physically and then the political structures that we've built, with a larger lens and a more critical eye.
I also want to mention too
Yeah.
that is an expert in queer ecology, and actually founded a organization called the Queer Eco Justice Project. I'm going to place this into the chat if you're interested.
Thank you, Bo, Leo, and Kenna. We have a lot of resources to go follow up on and some great specific ideas to advance equity for LGBTQIA populations, and particularly populations of color experiencing multiple and cumulative inequities and injustices. So thank you for that perspective, for the practical ideas and your day-to-day work. And Leo, particularly, congratulations to you on writing portions of the fifth assessment, finally discussing issues of queer climate justice and LGBTQIA disproportionate impacts from climate change. So congratulations for that publication. Looking forward to reading it. I will now turn it over back to Trinity for a few announcements before we finish. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you, Linda, and thank you again to Leo and Kenna and Vanessa for the presentations, and Leo and Kenna for engaging in that discussion. We do have a few announcements, as Linda mentioned, and so did just want to share this plug again for the upcoming webinar on December 13th, being held by UC Irvine School of Social Ecology in collaboration with FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, talking about this new analysis of disaster displacement. So I'm looking forward to that. We'll again paste the link to register for this webinar and link to the policy brief and recommendations in the chat. And then a reminder to everyone that the meeting is being recorded and should be posted online about a week from today. You'll be able to find the recording on the Climate Action Team Public Health Work Group meetings webpage at the link on the screen. We'll put it in the chat as well. And finally, I just want to express our sincere thanks to all of our presenters here via video, previous recording, and our facilitators, all the staff who helped pull this together, keep it running when we've had technical difficulties, and to all of you for bearing with us throughout those technical difficulties and joining us today. So thank you again, take care, stay healthy, and have a great rest of your day.